I'm into true crime stories, and an infamous case happened not far from here. We're in the town I grew up in, and my hometown is where a man named Jeffrey Scott Harnoff now lives. Harnoff rents a room in this elderly couple's home, and he's about the same age as I am, mid-50s. So we've probably crossed paths in this small state when we were younger. He was a police detective in the next town over, and in 1989, when he was 27 years old, he began an affair with a woman named Victoria Cushman. Harnoff was married with a young child at the time. Victoria was a college graduate, and she was a former Army intelligence officer. And being close to 30 years old, she was looking for a committed relationship. And she met Harnoff where she worked in this building, which was a sporting goods store at the time. She told her co-workers that she was dating a cop, and she was hopeful that he would end his marriage to be with her. But on August 9th, 1989, she arrived at work visibly upset that Detective Harnoff chose his family over her and ended their affair. Victoria lived right next door to the sporting goods store here on the second floor of this house. In 2 days after Harnoff ended their relationship, Victoria was found murdered in that second floor apartment right there. Near her body was a sealed letter she had written to Harnoff. The letter indicated that she was not accepting the breakup, and the letter Victoria wrote also identified her lover as police detective Jeffrey Scott Harnoff, a colleague of the officers who arrived at the murder scene. Victoria had been bludgeoned to death with a fire extinguisher. There was no sign of forced entry, but a window was left open. It seemed to the police that the window was open to stage a burglary, and that Victoria more likely knew her killer. Where was Detective Harnoff on the night in question? He attended a party with his wife and child. According to people at the party, Harnoff was in a very jovial, drunken mood, but his wife wanted to go home. They had a tiff, and she took their child and left without him. Harnoff disappeared from the party at about the same time Victoria was murdered. And he returned to the party later on in a different mood. The other partygoers said he was no longer jovial. He seemed serious, and he was kind of in a daze. But Victoria's letter that was found at the scene and Harnoff's lack of an alibi wasn't enough to charge him with murder. He passed a polygraph test, and the police just didn't want to believe that one of their own could have done this. A few years went by with no other suspects pursued by the police. But Victoria Cushman's father was not going to let his daughter's murder become a cold case, and he relentlessly demanded the police make an arrest. He even accused them of a police cover-up. I personally remember Victoria's father popping up on the news long after her death, consistently demanding justice for his daughter. He was a thorn in the side of that police department. And 6 years later, after the case was turned over to the state police, an arrest was made. Detective Jeffrey Scott Harnoff was charged with the murder of his lover, Victoria Cushman. And a jury found that the affair, the letter, the fact that Harnoff disappeared from the party at about the same time she was murdered, the staged burglary scene was enough to convict Harnoff. They decided that he must have killed her because she wasn't accepting the breakup, and he didn't want Victoria to destroy his family. And he was still married, and his wife was pregnant with their third child when he was sentenced to life in prison. But Harnoff and his wife ended up divorced while he was in prison. She gave birth to their third child while he was serving his sentence. He lost everything. His life seemed to be over, but he maintained his innocence. Harnoff had been sitting in prison for 6 years, and then a man named Todd Barry came out of nowhere. Todd Barry couldn't live with what he had done almost 14 years earlier in 1989. Barry dated Victoria Cushman before she got involved with the police detective. But he eventually broke up with her. He found her to be too obsessive when she would show up at his job sites where he worked as a carpenter. Even though he ended the relationship, Barry would still show up at Victoria's apartment once in a while for late-night booty calls, and she was okay with that. On the night of the murder, Barry got drunk and he smoked what he thought was marijuana, but it seemed the joint was laced with something else. He said he felt very odd that night. Barry climbed up to the second floor, opened the window, got into her apartment, and woke Victoria up, and they chatted for a bit. She told Barry about her married lover, who was a cop, and that she wanted him to leave his wife. Barry told her that she was wasting her time with a married man, and that upset Victoria. She then noticed that Barry left her apartment window open and her cat escaped. This resulted in a big fight, which ended with Barry beating Victoria to death with a fire extinguisher. Barry didn't know what came over him to do such a thing. He was never in trouble before. He wasn't himself after he smoked that joint. He eventually married and had 2 children. Barry came from a good family and he always worked, but he kept this horrible secret. But the guilt ate him alive over the years. He could no longer let an innocent man sit in prison for what he had done. The police were stunned when Barry told them what really happened that night years earlier.
A terrible thing happened with Vicky. She died. I killed her. I never, ever intended to kill this girl.
So Jeffrey Scott Hornoff walked out of this prison after 6 years.
It's a miracle, hon. It's a miracle. You're free, baby.
Life wasn't easy for a cop in jail. He was in there with men that he had arrested during his career. But he was grateful that Rhode Island doesn't have a death penalty. And the reason we don't have a death penalty is because an innocent man was executed in this state a long time ago. After his release, Hornoff got a $600,000 settlement, and it all went to his lawyers, his ex-wife, and his children. And now, 30 years after the murder, he's living here in my hometown with his dog after a second divorce. Hornoff struggled financially after he got out. He couldn't find a job even though he was completely exonerated. His second wife supported him and their child. He said that life was actually easier in prison. When you get out of prison on parole, there's a support system to get prisoners housing and jobs and education. But if you're suddenly exonerated like Hornoff was, you're just set free and you're on your own. His second marriage didn't survive the struggles. When I looked at his family's Facebook pages recently, it doesn't appear that he has much of a relationship at all with any of his children. So even 16 years after he was exonerated, Jeffrey Scott Hornoff may be a free man, but it seems his life is permanently broken.
But most of all, I missed my 3 sons growing up. That was the hardest part.